Hi guys, sorry the video didn't work yesterday. I'm trying to do another video here at home today so we can kind of cover what we covered in class yesterday. I don't know what's wrong with my YouTube app, but I'm going to delete it and try and fix it and see if we have a better result. Hopefully this video I'll be able to just message you and it won't cause us any problems. So mostly what we went over yesterday in class was this timeline, this AD 1 through 999 AD world history timeline. First talk about the pictures at the top. The first one is a Roman viaduct. This was actually the part of the water system that they had in ancient Rome. And as you can see, it's also all made up of arches. And the Romans really perfected the use of arches in their architecture to be able to create an architectural element that would hold a lot of weight, because arches are very strong without any central support. So that's more of a science thing, but that's part of what that's about. So, and then here we have, this is a Celtic cross, and this is from Ireland, and the Celts, the Celtic people became believers after St. Patrick, who was originally captured and taken as a slave out of the country. He managed to escape, but while he was a slave, he met Jesus. He had a conversion experience, and he went back to Ireland and began teaching the Irish people about Jesus. And we call him Saint Patrick because in the Catholic Church, people become saints when they do something miraculous. And of course, he brought Jesus to the people there, but also the legend is, there's no factual evidence that makes it for real for sure, but the evidence is, or the evidence doesn't show, but it's a legend that he got rid of all the snakes in Ireland. So that was kind of the miraculous thing that he did. And this next one is probably a pretty easy one. It's a Viking ship, pretty obvious. I don't know how that looks on the video, but you have the paper, I hope. So, and then this last one is what's called a step pyramid. And you can see how the sides go up the step. And these were built in the Americas by people like the Mayans, especially, also the Aztecs. And so this is how they built their pyramids. And on the top, it was flat because generally that was used for sacrifices. Sadly, many times human sacrifices. So that's what the pictures are about. I'm going to show you another set of pictures which you will not have gotten handed out or sent to you, but I can try and send you if I save them in my computer. But this place right here, this wall right here, which doesn't look like much now, but this wall was started in around AD 122. So a little over 100 years after the birth of Christ, the Romans started building this wall under Emperor Hadrian. And this is called Hadrian's Wall. And it was designed to keep the Norsemen, the Vikings, the northern tribes from invading England through Scotland. So if you can see on this map right here, this is where the wall was. I can't see where my finger is on the video, but you can see the red line on there is where Hadrian's Wall is. And basically it was completed almost all the way. There was just a couple of miles over there on the side of the North Sea that was never completed. It was also higher than this in many places. This is just one of the lower places, but in many places it was much higher. And what you see right here, there, is where there was a small fort that a couple of Roman centurions could stand guard there. And then down here on the bottom, this is the foundation, what's left of the foundation of what were Roman barracks, of where soldiers lived along the wall to defend it. So Hadrian's Wall, built in AD 122, and you can still go now to England and see that. So that was some pretty good building there, I guess you could say. So let's go ahead and look at this timeline real quick. Some of these things I'm sure you know already, that, you know, we mark the birth of Jesus around the year 1, and that's where we split between BC or BCE and the current era, or AD. And they think that he probably wasn't actually born in what we call 1 AD now, because of the way things change over time. It was probably more like, well, different scholars say different things, but past that time, anywhere from 7 to like 20 AD. But ancient times, it's hard to keep track of every single detail of things like that. So we're going to say 1 for now. And then we have this, he of course is born under the Emperor Caesar Augustus, who is followed by Tiberius, then who is succeeded by Caligula, who was a really bad guy. He was assassinated, followed by the Emperor Claudius. And then around the year AD 30, we have the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So, but at the same time over in China, the Han Dynasty is founded. So China, the ancient culture that it is, continues moving forward with new ruling houses, and this is the latest one of those. Claudius, the emperor when Jesus was crucified, not that the emperor had anything to do with that, that was all Herod, the Roman governor, but he is actually poisoned and is assassinated that way, and is succeeded by the Emperor Nero, who was the emperor during the time of Paul the Apostle, and he was eventually, he commits suicide. Nero is known as probably the most wicked emperor of them all. He tried multiple times to try to kill his own mother various ways. He didn't care about his people at all. He only cared about his own personal pleasures, and he was kind of a twisted guy, and like I said, eventually he commits suicide. And Jerusalem is destroyed during this period as the Jews try to revolt against Rome. It eventually leads to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple that has never been rebuilt. But we have Jesus, so we don't need the temple anymore, so that's all good. But Romans begin to persecute Christians as a result of that and the fires in Rome. And during this period, the Colosseum, which is an amazing architectural accomplishment, made up mostly of these arches like we talked about before. And the Roman Empire extends into North Africa and also into the Mesopotamia area, which is now modern day Iraq and Iran and that area. And so we move forward, and we talked about Hadrian already. Hadrian was an emperor who had this wall built in England. And he also rebuilds the Pantheon in Rome, this beautiful temple in Rome, and he establishes one of the first postal systems since the Mesopotamians had one way, way back in the day, a long time ago. And now, so we get this Roman postal system, one of the first in the post-ancient world. And this is the period when the Gospels are written, when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John write their documentation of the ministry of Jesus. And so I'm going to kind of move forward a little bit as we have the Roman Empire continuing around 250 AD, being invaded by the barbarian tribes, the Frankish tribes coming from what is now modern France, and the Goths. And but at the same time, in other parts of the world, we have Buddhism spreading in China, becoming one of the main religions in China. And also, this is when the Maya, the people in Mexico, are creating a very advanced civilization. Their science is highly advanced, and they are building temples, the oldest ones in Central America, and have a very organized, civilized society. Although it did, like I said, it did include human sacrifice. It also included what they call blood sport, meaning you would play certain sports and you would play till someone died. That was who lost, was the person who died. So they had kind of a savage culture, but a very sophisticated one in terms like of their astronomy and their architecture and things like that. So the Mayan, like I said, in Central America at this time. And then we get Constantine the Great, so around 300 AD, and he reunites the Eastern and Western Roman empires with the new capital at Constantinople, of course named after himself, Constantinople, built on the site of the city of Byzantium, which is a ruin at this point, and he passes what's called the Edict of Milan and makes Christianity legal. Eventually it will become the state religion, but at this point it's now legal to be a Christian. No one's going to kill you or crucify you for that. And they have a council called the Council of Nicaea, which lays down for the first time, these are the doctrines of Christianity. So, and that document still exists today. So going back to the east again, we have the Huns coming from Mongolia. Mongolia is part of China. I don't know if y'all have ever eaten Mongolian barbecue, but this whole idea, that's how they would take their meat, whatever meat they could find, and they would put it under their saddles, and they would ride all day, and the pounding of the saddle would tenderize the meat. Then they would, when they were done for riding for the day, because they spent most of their time on horseback, they would take one of their great shields, and lay it on the fire that they had built, and then they would chop up the meat and put it on there, and then anything anybody had collected in their saddlebags, any kind of vegetables or anything that would make it taste better, was thrown onto this shield, and it was all cooked together, and then they would all partake of that food. And so that's where we get this idea of Mongolian barbecue, where you put all your food in one bowl and they dump it on this big round griddle that looks a little like a shield, right? And that's where that's from, the Mongols, which are also called the Huns. Those are the same people. Attila the Hun is known as one of the great military generals of the world, and he was one of these Mongol raiders. He was able to conquer many cities with the powerful and fast raiding parties of his Huns. So moving forward, we get the permanent division of the Roman Empire, and the Western Empire being ruled from Rome, the Eastern Empire being ruled from Constantinople, but the Roman Empire is going to gradually shrink down to being just the city of Rome, weak emperors, not doing a great job, very much more interested in their own personal business and personal pleasures, and so they kind of neglect the city of Rome, and it is invaded by a few different what we call barbarians. As we've talked about, barbarians just means stranger. It means you're not a Roman. So we have the Visigoths who attack the city, and then we have Attila the Hun attacks the city and the areas surrounding that. And then this is the period, I mentioned St. Patrick, around 432. He goes back from having escaped being a slave, goes back to Ireland and brings Christianity to the Irish people. So as we move forward, we now have another barbarian tribe, the Vandals. Like, we use the word vandal for someone who destroys personal property. Well, the Vandals pretty much now destroy Rome. They wipe it out. Most of the city is left in ruins, except some of the great structures stay behind because they were so well built. They were not easy. They couldn't burn them because they were built of stone, and they were too large in many cases to be torn down. So the things like the Colosseum and some of the great churches were preserved, which was great that those things are still there. Justinian the First, who is also known as the Great, becomes the Byzantine Empire over there in Constantinople, and he issues a code of civil law that is to be followed there, and he also conquers North Africa, Italy, and part of Spain. So he's doing a little spreading out of his empire, and at this time, Justinian has sent missionaries to China, and one of the things the missionaries also do, besides being missionaries, is they bring back the secret of silkworms and how silkworms are used to make silk. This secret that China has guarded for centuries, maybe we can say millennia, which is 1,000 years. They've guarded this all this time, and now it is in the hands of the Byzantines, and China no longer has the monopoly on silk, and silk can be made anywhere after that once they get the silkworms and are able to propagate them and use their cocoons to then make silk. And that begins the European silk industry for the first time, and this period between 550 and 599, we have Muhammad, who is called the Prophet of Islam, founding the religion of Islam, and supposedly receiving divine inspiration to write their book called the Quran. And Islam begins to spread around first what we would call the Middle Eastern area, and then much farther, it goes all the way to Spain. And also at this time, Buddhism has spread now from India to China to Japan. So there's a large population of people who would call themselves Buddhists now in Asia. Okay, and so we get to 750 to 799, and Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, becomes king of the Franks, or the French. That's the Franks. We will start calling them the French eventually. And I don't know if you remember that Charlemagne's parents were Pepin the Short. And I asked the class yesterday if they remembered what his mother's name was, and they're all like something like it had something to do with like her feet or something, and it was of course Bigfoot Bertha au Grand Pied, so Bertha of the big feet. So that's why they think Charlemagne was tall, since his father was Pepin the Short. Most likely he got his height from Bigfoot Bertha. So that's just a funny little thing to remember. He was actually born, Charlemagne, Charles the Great was born in 742. So that's where we are. One of the leaders before Charlemagne was Charles Martel, who's of the same family as Charlemagne. And he actually defeats the Arabs at this point to prevent them from advancing into Europe. They will come into Spain at a later time from a different direction, but he fights them off at this point in time. Britain is beginning to suffer again under Viking attacks, and also the Vikings land in Ireland, and so the Vikings are still a huge danger, especially in the British Isles. They've been fought off more in other parts of Europe, but in the British Isles they are still struggling with that. And over in the Americas, Machu Picchu is an amazing city in Peru, in the Andes Mountains, that the Incas built. And they built it on the top of a mountain. And its ruins were found just in the last century. And it's quite an amazing city that they built up there in the clouds on the top of the mountains. The Inca were a very wealthy tribe. They had lots of gold, as a lot of the South American tribes did. And of course, most of that was stolen by people who found them and took it back to Europe. So Charlemagne is no longer just the king of the Franks or the French. He becomes what we call the Holy Roman Emperor, which means he now is the king of France and what we now call Germany. Back then, Germany was not a united nation. It wasn't a whole nation. It was a bunch of small states that were kind of in cooperation with each other. But so Charlemagne becomes king of that and king of all of this Holy Roman Emperor, and his crown has the actual crown put on his head by the Pope. And the Pope does that on purpose because he wants the world to see that ultimately he is an authority higher than the king. So the church has authority over the king, and this will become a great deal of conflict over the centuries of who's in charge of the church, of the country, the king or the Pope. So that will be for later time. And we are still having the Norsemen, the Vikings, and the various North tribes attacking around the Mediterranean even, but they're thwarted. They're fought off. They're not as strong as they used to be, but also the element of surprise is gone, and now a lot of these countries know what they're doing and fighting them off and thwarting them and not allowing this to happen. But they start to go farther afield and they discover Iceland, and they begin to populate Iceland. Now, if you remember, Iceland is a very beautiful country. In the spring and summer, it's green and it has lots of waterfalls. And Greenland, badly named, but named for publicity reasons by Leif Erikson, is actually pretty much just an ice cap with a little green around the edges. So it's flipped. So Greenland is icy and Iceland is green. But Leif Erikson was hoping to be able to bring settlers to Greenland, and that's why he called it that, because he thought he could start new colonies there. And we know that Leif Erikson, or at least a party sent out by him, made it actually to the northern coast of North America, up in the area of Nova Scotia. We know that Vikings had a settlement there. The evidence of it is there. The archaeological ruins are there, but it didn't last that far north. Maybe the reason why that it was a struggle for them, they just didn't have the resources they needed, and so that colony did not thrive and did not survive. But again, Leif Erikson is, as far as we know, the first European to land on the North American continent. So to set up a settlement on the North American continent. And so we'll move forward. Alfred the Great becomes the king of Britain, and he again defeats some of these Norsemen, these time the Danes coming from Denmark. They are thwarted, and we have Vikings founding a new nation that we now call Russia. Russia was founded by the Vikings, and they established a capital at a place called Novgorod, which is still, that's all part of Russia today. And it was all done by a Viking named Prince Rurik. He was the first leader of what we call Russia today. And by 900, we have the Arabs in Spain, the Muslims in Spain. They're Arabs and they're Muslims. They are called the Moors, Moors, and they are darker skinned than a lot of people in Europe, and so that's one of the things Europe has against them, besides their being Muslim. If you have ever heard of the Shakespeare play Othello, Othello is a Moor. He's dark skinned, and he falls in love with a white woman, Desdemona, and that kind of sets up the action for the play. So this story about the Moors. And then we get 950 to 999. We have Eric the Red, the Viking, father of Leif Erikson. He and Leif are founding this first Viking colony in Greenland at this point that I mentioned before. For the very first time ever in the world, musical notation, the same musical notation that you would use today if you were learning to play an instrument with two staffs and the notes and the clefs and all of that. If you know anything about music, if you ever taken any music lessons, that was all established back in the 900s. So it's been around for a very long time, 1,000 years or so. And finally, we get a new Holy Roman Emperor after Charlemagne, and his name is Otto I, and he is crowned by Pope John XII in 999. And so that is world history from that period of time. Hope y'all have your homework, and I'll see you Thursday. Have a great day. Bye for now.